Hello to everyone. My name is Monica Ricci, and I am happy to welcome you to our webinar today. I am the Marketing Director for Cat's Eye Consulting, and Cat's Eye is a growth consulting and digital marketing firm focused on the technology and cybersecurity space. The purpose of this Bright Talk channel, where we are hosting the webinar today, is to bring you insights and best practices for optimizing all of your firm's digital operations. So before I get into our content, I want to point out some logistics to all of you who have joined us. We welcome your feedback and your questions throughout today's webinar. So you should have a question panel on your webinar screen. And please do, as we proceed through our content, type in your questions to us. We have allocated some time at the end of today's webinar to respond to your questions, and we're looking forward to having that engagement with you. So today's webinar is titled Artificial Intelligence and Employee Security, Greasing the Wheels of Productivity. The sponsor of today's webinar is Plurilock, a North American-based technology firm that delivers employee identity and productivity management solutions for the digital enterprise. And these solutions are unique in their reliance on behavioral biometrics and machine learning. Plurilock's suite of solutions identify individual patterns based on the unique ways in which users use a keyboard, move a mouse or a pointer, or swipe on a touch screen. And I'm excited to introduce you to today's speaker, Ihab Sami. As Vice President of Product at Plurilock, Ihab is responsible for all aspects of delivering their solutions to the market, from product architecture to pragmatic marketing and client delivery. Ihab has previously held management positions at technology firms like Aptean and Pivotal, and joined Plurilock in 2017 as they entered the market with their patented technology. So without further ado, I'd like to turn this webinar over to you, Ihab. Welcome.
Thanks, Monica. So to start off the conversation, I'll talk a little bit about traditional security and authentication methods, which have always been designed to essentially put up stumbling blocks for employees. This is done because it's always challenging them at several points throughout their workday to identify themselves. And of course, for employees to be able to manage all of this and to do this, they have to remember and enter, as well as frequently change passwords. And that's not even talking or mentioning about multi-factor authentication yet. So what this has done is that it's created an environment where not only is security getting in the way of productivity, but it's having the opposite effect as users find ways around them to make their lives easier and to make themselves more productive. So this is where artificial intelligence and behavioral biometrics can actually change the whole authentication game. Think of a typical workday where somebody logs into their workstation, and usually in a more secure environment, they may use a PKI or a CAC card, for example, to log in along with a PIN code or a password. Once they're logged in, or even while they're logging in, as well as after, they may at times be prompted for second factor authentication, depending, of course, on which application that they're trying to access, or which type of step-up authentication they're doing. On top of that, some of these applications will require extra levels of authentication, and at that point, users have to log in again or use some additional step-up to log into these apps. The interesting thing about all of this is that even after all these different steps, it still leaves about 99% of the session unprotected, because between each additional point-in-time authentication that we just talked about, the workstation is pretty much completely open for others to use. Remote desktop connections to log in, for example, even malicious USB stick scripts to do some damage. And really the only thing protecting it is the physical presence of the end user on the workstation itself. Speaking of damage, 4 out of 5 data breaches use weak or stolen passwords, which will either belong to the user or a default device or server password that were never changed when that was implemented. And basically, that's where the problem with security lies. Between password policies, where you have to bend over backwards to get a password to be accepted, between special hardware that you can break, as well as makes the user carry something around, and multi-factor authentication, all of which can actually be stolen and worked around. all the current security methods don't really seem to be working. And as a result, a large share of the IT resources are actually dedicated to managing user interactions with user protocols such as password resets, for example. In fact, this is a big problem for a lot of CIOs. They know that users are often the weakest link in the security chain, but adding more cumbersome security protocols comes at the expense of user experience as well as productivity, to the point where the end users end up just putting up post-it notes on their monitor with their passwords or taping their PKI card into the workstation slot, for example. And this has actually caused a lot of hesitation for many CIOs to enact more security on their end users, and is therefore used by hackers as their #1 MO to be able to get into company systems. Now, with this in mind, I'll pause for 20 seconds while we ask the audience members to answer this quick poll question that we have. And really it's about which of the following authentication controls does your organization use. So this is interesting for us to be able to tell, is it complex passwords, and MFA, as well as C is pretty much all of them, or D is you really don't really have very many protocols. And it's actually pretty interesting to see some of the answers to that. I'll pause for just 10 seconds while we answer that question.
Yeah, I believe, Ihab, that the audience should be seeing a poll window in which they can vote for which of the answers most closely reflects their company's policy.
Perfect. So
I encourage you all to vote, and we'll go ahead and stop voting now. You can go ahead and continue, Ihab, and I'll come up with the responses in a moment.
So one of the interesting things about breaches, when you look at how most breaches take place, it always starts with a hacker or a potential malicious user trying to get access to the network. If you're an insider to that network, well, you're lucky you already have access and can exploit that access to access parts of the system. If you're an outsider, however, you probably have to steal some credentials, and this is the most common way, and usually done through some kind of a spear phishing attack or some other means to, or exploit some kind of vulnerability to get access to the system. Once you're in, the goal at that point is to elevate your privileges. Really, what that's about is it's trying to make you to be able to issue commands and gain access to resources. And hackers would actually often use and create new accounts at this stage so that they can remain undetected quite a bit longer. Now, of course, unless you're lucky, the system that you've gained access to isn't going to have all the data or all the information that you're searching for example, credit card numbers, personal information, intellectual property, etc. So the next step for you is to move around the network and try and find and get closer to the ultimate goal that you're trying to get to. This is usually referred to as lateral movement. And from there, what ends up happening is that you keep repeating that process until you get the needed access and permissions that to go after the ultimate goal that you're going after. And from that point on, once you've got that, you're free to wreak havoc or whatever havoc you have in mind within the system, whether that is theft or business disruption or anything else that you have. Now, unfortunately, in many cases, there are a bunch of things that we do that end up making it a lot easier for hackers to actually carry out these attacks. For anything from weak passwords and default passwords to stolen credentials to poor password management to shared accounts, as well as within the network, there are no limits to lateral movement. So a lot of corporate networks, for example, are designed to stop people from penetrating the firewall. But once people are within that network, there isn't very much to stop a hacker from going around and doing lateral movement. Now, the good news, of course, is that there is a way to stop attackers at multiple points in that kill chain, as well as to correct a lot of the management and administrative shortcomings that make it easier for these hackers to succeed. This is where behavioral biometrics and continuous authentication comes into play. So what is behavioral biometrics? In a nutshell, think of artificial intelligence that monitors the user's behavior and creates a profile that accounts for normal behavior for this user. It then runs continuously in the background, not just at specific points in time, but all the time. And then once it detects any kind of abnormality, it takes action. All of this while being invisible to the user, because all they need to do is go about their day-to-day business. The user doesn't really need to have stumbling blocks and enter passwords and have to remember a whole bunch of things. This is essentially what behavioral biometrics are. And BioTracker, which is Plurilock's product, actually uses behavioral biometrics. What BioTracker does is we use your typing rhythm and mouse movements to identify who you are. Different people will always have different cadence and rhythm when they're using the keyboard and mouse, and this is what we use to identify you. Now, of course, one very important point to mention here is that we monitor how you type on the keyboard and not what you're typing. Or what you're clicking on. So this is very important to the privacy world. So how does it work? Remember, this is frictionless. The end user, most of the time, doesn't have to know it's there, and the IT security team has very low maintenance to manage this. We've got a lightweight and easily deployed endpoint. It takes up actually less than 1% of the CPU and less than 50 megabytes of RAM. It doesn't require any additional hardware, unlike other solutions. It doesn't actually require that the user do anything else other than just use the workstation normally in the course of their day-to-day. The user registration and enrollment are actually done automatically. So if the user logs into the endpoint that is protected and the system hasn't seen them before, it will register them and begin to enroll them on that specific device. And then the enrollment allows it to build an initial profile for that user, and then once that profile is enrolled, then the system starts to automatically protect that user. Now, bear in mind, this actually protects the whole endpoint, not just a specific application or a specific website. When a registered and enrolled user begins using the endpoint, the agent actually collects data on how they're using the keyboard and mouse and encrypts that data together with some device identifiers and some unique agent key and sends it to the server to process. The server analyzes that data against their enrolled profile, and it essentially makes a decision on whether the user is who they're claiming to be or not. And all these events are actually comprehensively logged, whether the user was allowed or denied. There is the capability for false alarms that allow the system to learn as well as adapt to any changes to the user's profile over time. And that's very important to bear in mind with behavioral biometrics, is that human variations in usage and behavioral biometrics over time will actually do change, and the profile do change over time. Now, if the system detects an anomaly, what it does is that it can then challenge the user by locking that workstation, forcing them to re-authenticate basically, or with integration with other SIM systems or other applications within your network to allow more advanced analysis monitoring as well as more actions that can be taken. Speaking of a SIM system, BioTracker is actually designed to work very well with other technologies. As most cybersecurity products today that use artificial intelligence, one of the key points is to be able to interact and serve as a signal and work with other signals within the enterprise to be able to comprehensively understand what's going on from a behavioral biometrics perspective. And these are just examples to show that BioTracker is built it's built on a microservice-based architecture, and therefore it's available to integrate whether it's IAM, endpoint detection and response, privileged access management, or SIM systems that your customers may already be using. So with this, I will pause for a second and ask our second poll question. In terms of what type of technologies does your organization use?
All right, well, thanks, Ihab. I have gone ahead and pushed the poll question to the audience, so please do take some time to respond to this poll question. We're asking about what technology your organization uses, in which you are looking to deploy and manage your security, entity and user behavior analytics, or user behavior analytics, identity and access management, endpoint detection and response, SIMs, or some of these in combination or all of the above? And while you're voting, I wanted to make a comment on the previous poll question. I don't know if you had a chance to see the response, but it looks like the predominant answer among our audience was that the organizations tend to use a pretty complex ecosystem for managing passwords. The predominant answer was passwords plus multi-factor authentication plus hardware in combination. So that's what we were seeing among this audience.
Perfect. Thanks everyone for responding to that.
All right. So I think I'll give you a couple more seconds to respond, and I'll stop voting so you can go ahead and continue, Ihab.
All right, perfect. So one interesting thing to always look at with behavioral biometrics, or in this case BioTracker, is that there are a bunch of use cases where BioTracker is therefore really useful, and it can also be used in other parts of the organization. And additional use cases on top of what you see here, for example, are regulatory compliance, because we do serve as a silent and invisible multi-factor authentication system, or even aiding in forensic investigations. When you look at some of these use cases, for example, stolen credentials, whether that's done through a phishing attack or a data leak or user carelessness or any other means, once an attacker gains access to user credentials, they can actually cause a lot of harm and can be difficult to protect or to detect, simply because of the fact that they're logging in as a legitimate user within the system. BioTracker, though, will quickly act when it actually detects anomalies in the user behavior, because we know how the user uses the keyboard and the mouse, and will prevent that attacker from causing any damage by actually taking the necessary action to do that. When you're in an environment where you have named licenses for any type of online services, for example, quite often end users will share these named licenses to save some money, which creates, of course, both a security risk for the organization as well as loss of revenue for any kind of SaaS-based organizations. So BioTracker can actually be used to do that, to detect that the registered user is the person who has logged in to the application. One common activity that typically takes place in a lot of outsourcing organizations, especially overseas, is that they will occasionally substitute users with without the client's knowledge or consent. This actually puts your systems and data at risk, because they use a cheaper resource while they show you one other resource that you have vetted, and it's usually not the same person. So this is again another point or another tool that you can use for that. The other thing as well is the insider threats. So when you think about it, most internal bad actors are actually going to use other people's credentials or workstations. This makes them harder to detect and identify. But of course, BioTracker, because of the way that it protects, will actually very quickly recognize that the current user's biometric profile doesn't match that of the account owner, and then of course can log them out. So going even further than that, it actually can be used to identify the attacker by doing some analysis to try and figure out if that attacker profile exists within the system somewhere or not. Other cases, for example, could be things like remote access Trojans. So if the workstation is locally or remotely accessed, BioTracker, of course, can still check against the profile. USB and rubber ducky attacks. So most of the time they rely on some kind of typing commands in quick succession. And of course, because BioTracker recognizes the way you type, it will very, very quickly understand that this is not a human typing, and will, in our tests, we've actually found that in less than a second, the workstation is actually locked. Now, when it comes to phishing attacks, which are interesting, even though BioTracker cannot stop the user from clicking on a malicious link in an email, it can, however, detect that intruder once they've stolen the credentials and try to log in or take actions within the stolen account. Simply because of the fact, again, we are user-based and human-based, and so we try we will understand that this is not the user themselves. Also from a regulatory perspective, one of the things that you can think about as well is it can be used to find out who took which action on a network, by analyzing some of these biometric signatures of any of the actions. So BioTracker can actually search some of the existing user profiles to find possible matches, and essentially just confirm that the user was on the keyboard at the time that a specific action was taken. Think of that in critical infrastructure applications or even some kind of high-stakes financial trading organizations, for example. And of course, the last one is just simple user carelessness. BioTracker can actually just help prevent attacks. So even if the users leave their computers unattended and unlocked, or have easy to guess passwords, and thus make it easier for to use their accounts, we actually will very quickly lock them out if the biometric profile doesn't match, and therefore we will minimize the damage. Now, all of this will take place and will actually give you the added bonus of, think of it, the ability to eliminate or relax some of the current password policies which you pretty much have said you all have, and multi-factor authentication. So, think for a second of, the fact that you are quite confident that this end user is who they are just based on their day-to-day activities within the session, within the workstation. And therefore, that allows you to relax some of these frustrating policies, to replace some of the user policies with plurilock, so you don't have to have such complex passwords, for example. You don't have to have some of the annoying two-factor, or even, you will limit the two-factor authentication to just step-up authentication, so that so you only pop it up if for whatever reason the behavioral biometric profile of the end user doesn't match what's on file. So this is actually a tool that can help you to potentially relax and make it easier for your end users and more productive for the end users. And not only is it good for end users, but this technology can also be used for privileged users as well. So people who have access to regulated data or consoles that manage critical infrastructure, for example, or for even ensuring that the person you hired offshore is the one constantly working. The same thing applies for privileged access management. So the key is that it's an invisible layer that doesn't actually intrude on the user and cannot be spoofed, because it's impossible for somebody to try and copy the typing style of somebody else. So this actually brings us to the next poll question. So knowing what you know about BioTracker, we're actually very interested in finding out what would you do if you had BioTracker technology or behavioral biometrics technology available to you. Would you consider relaxing some of your password policies? So for example, requiring passwords to be less complex, or removing some of the other limits that you have on the passwords?
And thanks again, Ihab. I have pushed the question to the audience to vote in your polling window. It's a simple yes or no, so we'd really be interested in hearing your response. Well, I'll leave the vote open for a moment, and you can go ahead and continue, Ihab, if you'd like.
Thanks. So having said all this, the net result of having artificial intelligence technology and machine learning technology within the authentication space is that we now are starting to have a lot more options than before. And the natural evolution, or if you'd like to call it revolution, would be different types of authentications that are based on your organization requirements. So for example, in multi-factor authentication, we all know what that is. It's still going to be around for the time being, but now can actually be complemented or relaxed based on a whole bunch of specific scenarios. And one of the interesting things is that you'll start seeing these terms being used more and more in the industry as some of these technologies come out, and Plurilock being one of the leaders and the spearheads of this technology. We know how a lot of these new authentication concepts are taking place. For example, adaptive authentication. So adaptive authentication essentially is only authenticates users or only use specific protection mechanisms when necessary. So if, for example, you have 5 or 6 signals coming into for that end user, and 5 out of the 6 signals are showing that this is the user, you may want to not show that second factor authentication, for example, or not challenge the user for that. So adaptive authentication allows you to adapt to the current situation, the current scenario, that allows you to make it simpler for the end user, to make less roadblocks and less stumbling blocks for the end user, while at the same time maintaining that security. The other one is invisible authentication. So like BioTracker, where authentication now will start using more and more behavioral type activities. And it could be it could lead to a step up for adaptive, for example. So it may not be needed, since we're all aware that this is the user, without actually having to interrupt the workflows. This, of course, is even more effective when you consider the new term continuous authentication as well. So it is continuous, meaning that it's no longer a point-in-time type authentication. The user is constantly being authenticated, and in our case, for example, it's every 3 to 5 seconds where we know, we check whether this is the user and whether this is the behavioral profile for this user matches. So having this ability to analyze multiple signals from the enterprise and the users has actually opened up a whole new frontier in the authentication space, and has given us a lot more options and made a lot more options available for us. And you can be sure that a lot of these new technologies are actually going to be built on combinations of this evolution, and you're going to hear a lot more about all these different terms as we go forward. So with this, to summarize, BioTracker essentially uses artificial intelligence to build a profile on your end users by the way that they type on a keyboard and use the mouse. We then use that profile to provide continuous identity assurance as well as protect identity threats, all while maintaining user satisfaction, because you're not actually interfering or interrupting the user workflow, and there are no additional steps or interruptions to that end user. And with that, I will pause to see if there are any questions from the audience and to answer them.
Thank you so much, Ihab. Again, I'll remind the audience that you can enter questions by typing them in the question box that you have on your webinar panel. We do have a couple of questions that have come in during the course of this webinar, Ihab, and let me just read them to you. But again, if you have more questions as we go along, please do type them into the question box. So Ihab, the first question that came in is, in an age where privacy is extremely important, have you seen any pushback from customers or others about the privacy implications of this technology?
That's a very good question, actually, because we definitely get that question quite a lot about privacy implications, and it is absolutely true that that today customers care more and more about the privacy aspect of their end users and the profile of their end users. So with regards to this, Plurilock has two things. So number one, which I already mentioned before, Plurilock does not in any way track what you're typing or what you're clicking on. It is not contextual. It is always tracking how you are doing things. So for example, how quickly do you move? Do you keep a button on the keyboard pressed? How much do you move from one button to the other on the keyboard, for example, etc. As well as the mouse, how do you move the mouse around the screen or drag and drop, and the clicking style, etc. So we don't have any contextual data as to what you're doing. We just search for how you do things. That's sort of step one. Step two, as with any kind of software system, we have a data retention policy within the application, or data retention capabilities within the application that allows you, for example, to control how long you can keep data and have a lot better visibility into what kind of information you see. So there is no intrusion on the privacy of end users from that respect, and unlike a lot of other behavioral biometric type products, which actually analyze contextual data as to what you're doing, where you're visiting, what kind of files are being transferred, etc., Plurilock doesn't look at any of that.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Another question that came in, Ihab, is your product military ready, meaning has it been approved to be used in a high security environment?
The short answer is yes. We have, in fact, we do have military customers who are using BioTracker, and of course, as a result of having, or as part of having that set up on their systems and deploying this kind of implementation, you do have to go through a bunch of rigorous checks, as well as on-site testing of the product itself within the environment of that military. So yes, we do.
Okay, so last call for other questions from the audience. If you have any more questions, please type them in, but I certainly appreciate you having gone through this, Ihab, and especially the recap at the end, where there's sort of different, the evolution, or the revolution, as you call it, about authentication has been particularly interesting, and I think based upon some of the poll responses, From this particular audience, I think it indicates that a lot of organizations have a lot of complex technology and a lot of complex processes and methodologies that they use to manage their employee identity and security, and there's probably definitely some opportunity to do things better so they're less impactful to the typical user's workday. So let me just check one more time if there are any other questions. It looks like that's it from the audience.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, everyone. And I will feel free to contact us if you do have any questions or would like any more information or to schedule a demo or any kind of documentation. We're more than happy to answer that, or just check out our website or contact me directly with any specific questions that you may have.
Thank you, Ehab. That's great. So again, Ehab's contact information is here on this final slide, so you're all encouraged to reach out to him. And we thank you all for your attention. Thank you for joining this webinar today. And thank you, Ehab, and everyone. Have a great day.
Good. Thanks.